Good morning, everybody. I appreciate the chance to address you. Just let me say really quickly that I'm here kind of as a humble wildlife manager. Pretty distinguished group of people talking over the last couple of days. You know, successful lawyers from various sectors, landowners, large ranch managers, the biggest private landowner in Utah even yesterday. So we've had a lot of people who are pretty impressive to me. People in government agencies, state, federal, also some folks in industry. And so with some pretty genuine humility, I'm here to tell you a little bit about what I've experienced in roughly 20 years of working for the State Wildlife Agency in Utah. And I'm certainly less of an expert on many points than a lot of people in the audience, but I have, I think, experienced some things with my coworkers which can add to maybe a useful experience base that we can all talk about. So what I'd like to do is just sort of conversationally step through some of this. I really want to encourage you to kind of mark in your mind or on a pad of paper points of either commentary you want to make or questions, because I'd really enjoy a little bit of dialogue at the end. I'm going to try to keep my talk, down to about 20 minutes so that we've got a little bit of time to work with the material at the end. So what I'm going to do is just kind of step through, and my goal is basically to explain to you without a whole lot of strategy, more or less kind of a comfortable relationship, a discussion of how the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources perceives its mission when it comes to impact analysis and how we deal with stuff as it comes at us in the real world. So, all right. There are two particular parts of the audience I'd like to focus on. I remember what it's like to be a wildlife student, grad student, undergraduate. I really am speaking to those of you who are young professionals still in college. You're kind of in my mind. Also, particularly, I'd like to orient around visiting professionals. I know we've got practicing wildlife managers and scientists from at least 3 adjacent western states, pretty well represented. And so you're part of the audience that I have in mind because you've got experiences that are different from what we've faced in Utah, and I think you're in a really good position to maybe add some stuff that we haven't thought about. Let me just reiterate, I want some new ideas. I welcome your criticism. I won't take it personally. I really want you to talk with me at the end, ask some questions, and even challenge me, and that's okay. Let me kind of succinctly point to who we are, what we do. We are the State Wildlife Agency. We've got missions that are laid out in state law, which are a lot like many western states. We do have the role, and this is kind of a paraphrasing, but we're supposed to ensure a future for protected wildlife. We're really supposed to supply reliable knowledge. We are the ones who determine the facts. We don't, by ourselves at least, make wildlife policy. And so there is a pretty broad recognition that there's a need to add social policy, economic considerations into the larger sphere of managing wildlife. And the Utah Wildlife Board is the entity that's charged with doing that. So they are appointed by the governor individually from a number of interests. And so we don't need to spend a great deal of time on what their roles are, but this paints a picture if you don't happen to be aware of it. They're supposed to recognize the essential role that wildlife plays in a healthy ecosystem in a thriving environment. The second one is worded in a way that kind of catches you maybe at first, but recognize the impact that wildlife can have on man's economic activities and needs. Balancing wildlife needs with man's activities then is something that is an important part of the Wildlife Board's role, folding in social and economic interests, but nonetheless aiming to maintain wildlife on a sustainable basis. So there's a little bit of a functional partnership between the State Wildlife Agency and then our policy-making body. And the bottom line is that at the end of the year, at the end of the decade, we need to be accountable to having preserved, protected, and done a number of other conservation-oriented things with wildlife. But it's not just black and white. We really are in a mix, needing to negotiate on a number of points. So when it comes to wildlife harvest, it's a lot easier because it's a lot, not that that's not technically challenging at times, but we know what we're doing. We've got numbers, we've got law behind us. Nobody really challenges our ability to enforce fish and wildlife laws, require licenses, et cetera. But Utah doesn't really have anything at the state level that equates to an environmental law, at least not that's germane to the Wildlife Resources Division. There are certainly some environmental laws on the oil and gas side and with environmental quality, but we don't have any kind of, and this is my opinion anyway, we don't have an overarching environmental law that could give me as a state wildlife manager much leverage or much ability to apply force of law. So as we heard from the previous speaker, we often find ourselves talking. We use information wherever we can get it. We use reason, logic, and just basically persuasion. We negotiate. We try to talk about what makes the most sense. And we know from our leadership that energy development is going to happen, as has been said a few times. There's never a concept that we are going to do anything but work with energy development. But there is a pretty strong corollary principle that we're going to do it in a manner that's conscious of opportunities to minimize impact. So we're going to develop energy, but we're going to do it responsibly. The way that I think we take that directive, and that is a policy that's established, within the executive branch of government. It's written in the energy policies that we're addressing. What we need to recognize is that we're compelled to work with energy companies, and also energy companies by that same policy are sort of pushed into needing to work with us as managers of the other natural resources. So I think that's the expectation. And what it's resulted in is that I think sensible companies have picked up on the value. They've internalized it. They have, in my experience, begun to demonstrate an awareness that they carry some obligations to manage wildlife, to help us manage wildlife and help us reduce impacts to a lot of other resources. And again, we see the need to kind of move back and cooperate with them. So when we see an energy company who's stepping up to the line and offering something back, being willing to invest either in the preferred mode of avoiding or reducing effects, but also kind of at the last stage of being able to provide some compensatory mitigation, we find that it's a give and take. I guess that's what I'd like to say. One of the things I really want to stress to kind of characterize how we view this whole thing is that it's not a big effort to gather compensatory mitigation funds. We don't really think we're getting a lot of criticism on that, but at one point we had people accusing us of trying to get money because that was, we were in this to get funding and that would help us do wildlife projects, and it was a form of extortion. And I think that's largely dissolved. You hear that occasionally from people in the industry, but generally not. Part of the reason we've gotten away from that, or the ability we've had to get away from that, is based on assessing impacts, having mitigation plans that quantify what's going on, and then actually entering into agreements that bound what the impacts are, what we're trying to do. And so we've got a kind of a document to show to the public or to people in the industry. It's really about understanding the system. So what we really are compelled to do is sort of get involved early. And the place where you gain your greatest benefit in the mitigation game, as we see it, is by really reducing that footprint or reducing the duration, avoiding reducing. The compensation is always what comes last. And it can be pretty exciting at times to do a big project that provides a return benefit, but I guess the implication is you're probably losing because you're probably not successfully compensating for all of the effect, but it's the best thing that's left. That's all you've got left once you get to the point of having avoided and reduced, and you're just kind of stuck with some impact. So The sequence that you move through by avoiding and reducing, I think, is pretty important, because if you don't do that, if you just open the negotiation and you talk about compensatory mitigation as the starting point, I had a little bit of a hard time thinking how to verbalize this, but you're actually almost encouraging destruction. If you talk to an energy company and they walk in and they say, well, look, what we want to do is basically write you a check and do precisely what we want. How about that? You have to look at the details, but it's like putting money into a path that isn't the appropriate one. You might actually be fostering destructive development, and so we're concerned about that. And this is just kind of a heuristic, a principle I'd encourage you to consider if you haven't already, is that it's just always better to avoid the impact and reduce it to the maximum extent you can. That's always preferable to being paid for a compensation program. And I heard someone earlier this morning state in a presentation that it's not about, the money, the mitigation money is really not the objective. The objective is actually the act of ecological replacement, or some sort of adding back into the ecosystem what was taken, and that's really the truth. I mean, money is kind of the means to a compensatory mitigation end. It's not the objective. It sometimes can provide the best mechanism. Everything's different. Every large-scale oil and natural gas development program I've worked on, from 80 wells to 800 wells to now 5,000 some odd wells in some of the development plans, are all different. They have their own kind of distinct qualities, strange limitations, things you wouldn't have expected, and they also offer opportunities to do some good stuff. The real key is to sort of be flexible, always be thinking, get involved as early as you can, and sort of repeat your visits, so you can develop some expectation. And you really have to stay agile mentally. You have to be willing to listen to others and be flexible in your thinking somewhat. The one thing you really need that you can't make, and I think this is something I've observed, wherever we've had resounding successes that were kind of against the odds, there was always this quality. We had somebody within, and I'm for sake of discussion, I'm kind of creating camps. That's not really how it works, but sort of on the environmental ecological side, which I would put myself on as a state wildlife agent, we have a camp. We're trying to conserve, we're trying to minimize impacts. And then there's the other camp, for sake of painting the picture, who is focused on development and promoting cost-effective energy development and production of energy. You need someone in both camps who really understands that we're in this together. If we cooperate, if we do some things constructively, we've got an opportunity to meet a lot of people's needs. It takes some giving and it takes some flexibility, but I think we've had that. But boy, where things have been intractable and we've not been able to make them work, this is one of the features that has been absent. There's been sort of like a one-sided willingness to partner, and that never works. And so I think some of the larger energy development companies are demonstrating some pretty progressive mindset these days. And I don't particularly want to focus on companies, but just to kind of spurt some names out there to give you a sense. Bill Barrett Corp has come up in the discussions here. Anadarko Petroleum, who bought Kerr-McGee. Newfield Production, Enduring Resources, XTO. Can't remember their full business name, but XTO Energy, I think. So we have some companies that are of various sizes doing some pretty good things. Where we run into difficulty and have a hard time finding sort of progressive partnerships is often in the smaller companies who don't quite have the capital to allow them to, as they would see it, have the luxury to kind of think expansively and try to do some good things. And I just want to encourage those of you who might be wandering into the situation thinking, oh, how are we ever going to do this? I've got a lot of examples I could talk about. We could discuss situations if you've got knowledge of anything in Utah. I've been involved in most of those, but sort of my process, my conclusion overall is that if you're exercising your best skills as a critical thinker and you're really listening and you're going out and accessing information, making use of the best science that's available, but also talking to geologists and petroleum engineers and thinking about what's practical, that answers, and I put it in quotation marks for a reason, answers will emerge. They won't necessarily be sort of like with a confidence interval that's really tight. They won't be well supported by a broad base of science all of the time. But it'll become clear to fair-minded thinking people all around the table that 3 or 4 major courses of action really are making the most sense. They generate the best value back to the energy company. They are most meaningful to a wildlife population or habitat of concern. And so you sort of look for those, and it seems to me that you normally have a reasonable collection, like a handful of really pivotal mitigation options that will emerge if you're talking and if you're thinking. You just got to stay calm. You just have to think. One of the things that I had to get to the sort of the hard way is recognizing that to some extent we are an agent of the people, in sort of a political push. We work in the executive branch of government, so my commander-in-chief is actually the governor, which is true of any state employee on this side of, in the executive branch. But I'm a wildlife biologist. That's my background. It's my orientation. But I also am answering to people who are elected. And I think there's something constructive in realizing that you're part of a system and that you kind of need to reflect some of what's going on. We have our minds everywhere. Those of us who work in impact analysis have to be kind of Jacks or Jills of all trades. We have to be willing to go everywhere and do everything within our ability. It's a lot of science, it's a lot of talking, it's being aware of political currents. I don't think you ever give away your basis as a wildlife manager because you've got this responsibility you can't abrogate. You've got to be the provider of reliable information. At the end of the day, the governor's staff need to be able to come to you and say, what's going to happen if that action takes place and it impacts these species? We need to be a source of refined understanding. But it sure helps if you've got an awareness that the elected officials are encouraging development on public lands, for instance, because that way we can find ways to get places that we need to be. What we're really doing is we're not practicing warfare. It's not combat. And probably as a younger biologist, I was more prone to look at it that way. I thought we were fighting for wildlife, and by golly, we were going to stamp anybody out who got in the way of wildlife's needs. I don't think that's a sustainable strategy, and it's also not quite the fairest when you consider how we're fitted into the government system. I've come to the opinion anyway that what we're really doing is practicing a diplomacy, kind of a peaceful art of negotiating and talking. You don't have to fight to be a worthy element in a negotiation. If you've got really good information and you're listening and you're playing fair and you're sort of letting goodwill and sort of a beatific intent for the outcome guide you, facts arrayed in the proper manner can be really pretty compelling. And I've heard themes of that emerge in the talks, particularly this morning, but also yesterday, that if you've got the best information and you're laying it out there in kind of a rhetorical fashion that makes the most sense, you're probably going to get a persuasive influence. Good ideas are going to emerge. And so there's subtle arts. And I was rereading The Art of War the other day and had to add this little bit, but this is one of the tenets of that book that has a lot of very interesting things in it. But if you can win the minds, in this case of your opponent or of the other party, then the economics and the politics that will be necessary for success will follow. If you've never read The Art of War, I encourage you to. It's about war, but it's also about like public administration and well, you think about the samurai. They were the people appointed to positions of governance pretty quickly after they became government administrators. I think there's an odd relationship between combat and government, but I'm encouraging diplomacy and sensible relationship building. You got to have relationships. I want to stay moving along pretty quickly here. So usually you have older biologists and younger biologists working together. That's a good formula that creates some kind of flow, some sort of institutional consistency. And I don't know that we're going to have a lot of time to go into the future of what these kind of opportunities present themselves, but consider what you're mitigating for. You might be mitigating for the mule deer that were impacted by something coming into winter range, where the principal limitation you're facing in a watershed or in an area might be not so much the winter habitat for mule deer, but rather winter habitat for sage grouse or brood rearing habitat for sage grouse. So probably don't really have time to develop that, but just really quickly in kind of exiting the question, I think some of the needs that stand out and some of the things we might be falling short on right now, not universally, but in some cases, are, I don't know how thoroughly we're monitoring. Surely we're monitoring vegetation treatments at some level. We're monitoring wildlife populations, not by project, but overall. It's just essentially impossible to get good, reliable estimates of wildlife, per vegetation treatment. I don't know if we've negotiated enough benefit sometimes. Over the last 6 years, we've probably got $2 million worth of, in round figures, $2 million worth of mitigation, compensatory mitigation coming back in. What have we avoided and reduced, though, through successful negotiation? And maybe I'd just like to say, I wonder if we're really monitoring as much as we should, because if I were working for a company, I wouldn't be able to demonstrate right now a return on investment for all the mitigation dollars I've juggled. I'm a little bit discomforted by that, but I see in myself an unwillingness to take limited money and spend it on monitoring when I could spend more of it on doing more habitat work. And so I at least would like a couple of tough questions, maybe some harsh comments, constructive comments if you want, but I'd like a little bit of dialogue, and we've got just a few minutes, not a whole lot of time, but I just kind of wanted to lay out for you how we look at it, what we tell an entering biologist. And so maybe if somebody wants to raise the lights a little bit, I'd be happy to deal with some tough questions. For the recording, I'll just say the generalized question was, where have we had some important successes for avoiding impacts, reducing impacts? And then can I give some kind of proportional outlay of where we've had good success, or either in avoiding or reducing, or in successfully compensating for impacts? So I'll just try to lay a few things out there. One thing we have come across in the last while are large-scale interstate natural gas pipelines. Those are really important because they're one of the two factors that I'm told have limited natural gas export from Utah, which turns into dollars. And so we need big interstate natural gas pipelines. What we've basically done is like with Ruby Pipeline or the Kanda Pipeline, which were both regulated by the Federal Energy and Regulatory Commission, we did everything we could to help steer away from problem areas. We were concerned about things like pygmy rabbit habitat or greater sage grouse issues or big game winter range, and even some sensitive fish species, stream fishes. But the company was able to respond within reason to the things we urged for avoidance as far as timing and location and conserving riparian habitats. There still were some undeniable impacts. In the case of the Ruby Pipeline, which came all the way across northern Utah, went from Opal, Wyoming to Malin, Oregon, along a big interstate natural gas pipeline, we actually negotiated compensatory mitigation payments of about, if it was $1.2 or $1.4 million. Didn't come to DWR, it came into the Watershed Restoration Initiative, which is a multi-agency cooperative effort designed to provide a mechanism for taking, in some cases, compensatory mitigation payments and redirecting them, or I should say directing them to the mitigation cause they should have been aimed toward. So we had strictures like must benefit sage grouse, must benefit migratory birds, must benefit mule deer winter range, and we also scaled it by, in this instance I'm referring to, the 8-digit hydrologic unit code, or the HUC-8 watersheds. And so if the impact had this much in a watershed, there was that amount of money that needed to come back into and be invested back into that watershed, which which helped focus some of the compensatory benefit back where it occurred. As far as percentages of, I think, I don't have a measure, but qualitatively, I think we're doing pretty well expressing good sense and getting avoidance and reduction within reason. Companies, oil and gas companies, have, probably for some of their own reasons and also for reasons we've urged, made closed loop systems. They've stopped having as many open pits. They're recycling a good portion of their drilling fluids, reducing water consumption. They are choosing to do directional drilling where the geology permits it in many cases, thereby reducing the footprint, cutting down on new disturbance. And we're operating on a large scale, like one that is recently approved and is being developed is the Greater Natural Buttes field. And I forget the precise number, but it seems like it was going to have something like 3,700 new wells, within a range. That's big, but a lot of those are going to be drilled from existing pads. And so there's not a commensurate increase in the footprint of disturbance. And we had some good compensatory mitigation negotiations with those companies, which, this is the way we looked at it. We thought, well, we're in a field, in the case of Greater Natural Buttes, that has had pretty intensive natural gas development already. This is kind of down south of Roosevelt in the Greater Natural Buttes field. New technology permits economic recovery in natural gas. What have we impacted? What can we fix? And so a lot of qualitative stuff here, but we recognize that with change in drought patterns and climate, pronghorn have suffered. We've had some pretty tough pronghorn years. So one of the things the company agreed to do was fund a kind of a cooperative development of 12 wildlife water developments aimed at guzzler benefits for pronghorn. So in this large, and I forget the acreage, but this large area, we're putting out 12 wildlife developments, water guzzlers, and the idea is we're going to add some resilience and maybe some survival of young pronghorn, but some resilience to the population. And so we've done a lot of weird things like that. That's only a partial answer, I'm sure.
One more very quick.
The question generally was, how are we going to manage when we're negotiating for the indirect effects which couldn't be avoided and a compensatory payment comes in, could that be directed toward research value that might improve our ultimate ability to lessen wildlife impact in the future? My feeling on that question is, or on the answer to that question is, in some cases, research is the critical need. That is, we don't know enough to do anything to help, and so we need to sort of take the obstacle out of the way. We need to get a step or two closer to understanding what really works. But I don't think we're going to do a lot of good for achieving a compensation for the damage if we invest very much of our limited mitigation pool on research. There are cases, like one case quickly that I can think of is, could there be Raptor excluder devices that haven't been quite operationalized yet, which could work? And the research has shown that a number of the designs that have been tested don't work. Could there be some additional research money put toward developing designs that work? That might provide some opportunity to do some good, but we have in a couple of cases needed to know where specific sage-grouse populations moved, so we accepted money from a company in the West Havaputz Plateau area to put collars on birds and to have people tracking movement. And we got good insight there, but as you can appreciate, that doesn't generate any return on the system other than it increases our understanding. So I think we need to be judicious on what proportion of mitigation money we use for research findings, but there are cases, 10-15% of the money, I don't know what's right, but there are cases where it makes sense. In general, though, I like to plow it back into the system if we've got just enough information to be sure that we're reducing a limiting factor, doing something that really would help.
Let's give Bill a hand.